Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and I'm your host, Bill Roach. And today we're going to be interviewing Brandon Clubb, who is a pastor in Meade, Kansas. And we're going to be discussing the topic of how do you pastor a rural church? And the reason that we're looking at this is because so many people in our country today are actually pastoring rural churches. So we're going to get some of his insights on how do you find a rural church, pastor a rural church, and engage in that kind of context here. So with that said, we're going to bring on our guest, Brandon Clubb. Hey, Brandon, how are you?
Good, Bill. How are you doing?
Good, good. Let's just jump in here and tell us, where you're serving at and how long you've been there, and a little bit about your family.
Yeah, I am in Meade, Kansas, serving at Emmanuel Mennonite Church is the name of the church that I'm at. We've been here 2 years. Came from Kansas City to Meade, Kansas, which is in southwest Kansas, south of Dodge City. If anybody's familiar with Dodge City, I've got
Do we need to get the heck out of Dodge sometimes, Kansas? You know what I'm talking about?
need to get into Dodge.
Get into Dodge, okay.
Uh, um, I have 7 kids. Just had a new baby. Got the baby fresh smell on him. About 2 weeks ago. He's been around 2 weeks now, and we're just living the dream in Meade, Kansas.
Well, that's great. Now, let me ask you this. Not only do you have 7 kids, but what is Meade known for? What's one of the famous things that is known for Meade, Kansas?
Oh yeah, Meade, Kansas is known. I mean, everybody knows. I don't know if I need to say it, but we're known for the Dalton Gang Hideout.
What in the
Everybody knows.
world is the Dalton Gang Hideout?
So the Dalton Gang Hideout is a little house that uh, the Dalton Gang was a group of notorious bank robbers and Wild West type guys. And they had a house that they would go hide out in. And if the authorities showed up, they had a tunnel that they dug out of the back of the house to the barn. And they would be alerted to the authorities. They'd get in that tunnel. They'd go out to this barn and get on their horses, and they'd ride off before the cops could get to them. So you can go to the Dalton Gang Hideout, and you can go through their tunnel and go check out their house. And it's actually a pretty cool little museum.
In other words, you're saying hide and go seek is amazing in Meade, Kansas.
Oh yeah, Dalton Gang is the hide and seek champions for years now.
So Brandon, let's look at this topic here and let's try to engage a few things. Now, one of the things that I've heard it said, and you can give us your opinion on this, is that in a large setting, like an urban setting, in many ways, you earn your right to counsel based off of your preaching ministry. But in rural context, you earn your ability to preach based off of your counseling ministry and the way you engage with people. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's correct or incorrect?
Yeah, I think that holds a lot of truth. Um, the reality is when you're doing ministry in rural settings, you are seen every day, and people are more concerned with how you treat their fellow citizens in the bank or at the local gas station or the local restaurant. They see that constantly. So my counsel and my actions are so closely watched that if I have a bad reputation in town, immediately my right to counsel and to speak is done. I kill it. So I think there's a lot of truth to that statement.
Now, do you find that ministry in a context like that requires you to be more engaged with people versus, you hear some people saying at a bigger church they have a larger staff. How do you balance that where you got to be engaged with people in a counseling ministry versus sermon preparation?
Yeah, I mean, you just because there is an aspect where you have to um, definitely be engaged with your people. So, just kind of a funny story. When I got here 2 years ago. I was here a week, and I remember I was driving by a deacon in our church, and one of the things you do out in Western Kansas, in probably any rural area in the world, you're driving, you got your hand on the steering wheel, you see someone pass, what do?
You
Right? You
wave.
wave. What you do. Coming from Kansas City, you don't wave at anybody. Nobody cares who's the person beside him, right? And I remember we passed on the road, and I was not paying attention. I didn't know whose car was who. And I got home, and I got a call. And the deacon was just playing with me. He said, he goes, "Why are you so mad at me?" But there's an aspect where you're engaging all the time with people. Whether I go to the grocery store or I go to the gas station, I'm engaging with people on a regular basis. And that's important to them. Now, you have to balance it well, because in a small ministry, I mean, I could have people, I could be engaging with the community all the time and never have any sermon prep. So you have to balance it really well, and that you just kind of have to make priorities. So for me, in the mornings work really well. If I can come in the morning and start my sermon study and lay that out, then that gives me kind of the afternoon to kind of move at a pace where I can go and visit people, or I can go to the rest home or wherever I need to go. But for me, that works out the best. Now, for the guy, so the church I work at, we have a senior pastor, and I'm the associate pastor. For the senior pastor, his mornings are actually more kind of engaging people around him, and then his afternoons are more in the office. And I think some of that depends on the kind of guy you're geared towards. Some guys work really well in the morning. Some guys are more evening guys, but I'm more of a morning guy. So that's how I balance it. But I think everybody would have to find their own niche.
Yeah, I've found that to be the case myself. We both grew up in really small towns, and I do think there is a lot of truth to the idea that you have to earn your right to be heard in a small town based off of a counseling ministry and the way that you engage people. Whereas in a large urban setting, you really don't engage people like that. People are passing and going, just trying to get to work and deal with traffic. So I think one of the key points that you're making, and that a lot of rural pastors will make, is that you really do have to earn your right to be heard by the way you're engaging people day in and day out. Now, another thing that you'll hear a lot of people say is that you have to preach different whether you're in an urban setting or a rural setting. And I know we've discussed this numerous times before over the years, that really that's just kind of catering to this idea of contextualization, where people think that you have to so over contextualize where you're preaching and how you say it and so forth with that. But what advice would you give for sermon preparation and sermon delivery in a rural context? We're not trying to be given over to this contextualization approach, but what advice would you give both in preparation and in delivery?
Right. Well, first, like you said, we don't give ourselves over to the contextualization approach. So I'm not trying to fit the gospel, into some sort of world that I leave the gospel behind, right? So the gospel is the gospel, and that's the truth of Jesus Christ, and that's what everybody needs. Doesn't matter if they live in a town of 50 or in a town of 50,000 or 500,000. They need the gospel of Jesus Christ. But there is an aspect where you have to understand that your illustrations and kind of your applications can hit differently than they might hit at Kansas City. Obviously, I'm not going to use an illustration of how to apply something at a Kansas City Chiefs game or Royals game. There's not too many of those going on here. But I can. So, for instance, I remember. So my wife, like I just mentioned, my wife just had a baby, and we were talking about Matthew and end times and like labor pains for a woman and all these things of looking at those. And that was really making sense to me. And I was talking to someone on a Sunday after a sermon, I think, and I was just telling them that's just so much coming alive watching my wife as we get closer, and she's having what they call Braxton Hicks, which are false labor pains, but they're meant to prepare the woman's body for labor, and they get more intense as time goes. And just watching that, and he says to me, it's an old farmer, he says, yeah, but it always, anytime I read where it talks about being able to watch the weather, and based on the color of the sky whether you're going to have rain or not, he said that always makes more sense to me. And so there are certain illustrations and certain things that pull people in a rural setting that probably wouldn't pull in someone in a city setting or a big cultural context setting. So there is an aspect where you're not contextualizing the gospel, but you are ensuring that the illustrations you use are going to hit closer to home with them. I remember preaching through Malachi, and one of the illustrations in Malachi is talks about a young bull that's skipping through the meadow and the joy that's there. Well, that really hits home. They really understood that. They walk out their door, go to work, and 9 out of 10 of them watch a young bull skip around in a field. So they get that. Whereas in Kansas City, a lot of people might not really, would not really get that illustration. So you
So
do have to be mindful.
the parable of the sower preaches very well in a place like Meade, Kansas, whereas
Yeah,
in Kansas City, probably not so much. They're not given over to farming and that, just given that they're in the city and so forth. So you think that in many ways, a lot of the biblical text, because it was rooted and grounded in a rural context like that, probably comes alive quite a bit in a rural setting. Now,
yeah.
how
I
do
mean,
you
there's more biblical illustrations from rural settings than there are city settings. I mean,
so now that you're in a more rural setting, it's usually you're dealing with a group of people where it's a small town setting. How do you balance the sermon preparation so that you're still feeding your congregation with what they need, but also you have other responsibilities? I mean, you have to sometimes drive several hours for a hospital visit, or you're going to different events, like you were saying you were helping somebody with a legal issue recently. And how do you balance all of those activities and sermon preparation?
yeah, I mentioned earlier, you just have to set your priorities and make your time your time. So, like you're mentioning, if I were to get a call right now and someone needed to go to the hospital and they were in an emergency context, I would have to go to the hospital in Wichita, which is a 3-hour drive. Or some of them are life flighted to Kansas City or other places. So there's always the possibility in rural setting that not just your day is going to be shot, but you might have 3 or 4 days of travel time that you can't account for. Now I'm very lucky here in that I've got another senior pastor here who we spread that out, so we don't both always have to go, and we try to balance that out. So if I'm preaching that week, then he'll take kind of those emergency cases, and then vice versa as we switch preaching. But you have to be very intentional to understand. You have to get ahead. You have to use your time wisely so that if something does come up, you've already kind of worked in your schedule a day where you can give up. And you just have to think that way. You just have to be mindful of that possibility.
So, one of the things that we know each church has to do is they have to look at, how do I make curriculum? How do I train these people and disciple them within the church? Do you find most curriculum written for churches is geared for the urban church or for the rural church? And if it's the later, which resources would you recommend?
Yeah, the vast majority of anything you pick up is going to be geared toward the mega church, city church mindset mentality, and that makes it difficult. But there are good resources out there for rural ministry. Um, RHEM, I think, or RHME, maybe is the name of a corporation or a parachurch organization that works in rural ministry. That's really well. New Tribes Missions is one. But the vast majority of books you pick up are going to be big city material. And so what you have to do is, I still use those materials. I just put them into context of where I'm ministering at. So one book I was reading by Steve Vyers is a book that is all about reaching your community through your church. Now his church is doing it in Lafayette, Indiana, with a church of 2,000 people. Well, in Meade, Kansas, we still want to reach our community. That's still something we've been called to do. The Great Commission is for every church, right? And so it's a matter of taking his principles, where he's building skate parks and he's doing what do they call them? Community centers with like gyms and walking stations and all that, and he's building those in his city. Well, in Meade, Kansas, we don't have too many skate kids walking around looking for a place to go skate park at. So we're going to take those same principles, we're going to apply them into our community, but we're going to dress them up for our needs of our own community. What are our needs? What are we looking at?
Brandon, so you're telling me you're not doing 50-50 dark side ollies up there at the Chuck Wagon on Friday
No way,
nights?
bro. Yeah, no, not a lot of that going on.
I think
But
what
I
it
mean,
is that from what I'm hearing is you're just saying you have to take the wisdom given in these books and learn how to rightly apply them to your context.
yeah,
And I think that's something that as people are going through an interview process with a church, maybe they should be asking individuals, how are you going to apply the resources that are out there to our local church setting? Because that could be different. There are some where they just pick up a curriculum and they run with it, whereas in other places, I know where I grew up, you couldn't always just run with it because, like you were saying, the resources just aren't there. You don't have all of these things from the rural setting that you might find in an urban setting. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a reality of where it is and where things are spread out. Now, let me look at another thing here. One thing that I've always heard is that when you're in a rural setting, you don't just pastor that church, you pastor that community. How do you balance that within your ministry? What is that like? How can you explain to somebody what it's like to pastor a community in that regard?
yeah. Well, and go back to the beginning of the discussion we had, where you kind of earn your right to counsel, right? The place I'm at, the senior pastor has been here for 20 years, and so he has laid a really strong, good biblical foundation that has allowed him to be, in many people's eyes, the community pastor. So if there's someone who gets out of jail and they need a ride somewhere, or if there's someone who comes through town and they need a hotel room or a meal or whatever it is, or even like somebody at the hospital who wants to see a pastor but they don't have a church, he typically gets the call. 9 out of 10 times, he's the guy who gets the call. So he is, in a lot of ways, the community pastor of Meade, Kansas. And what that means is you can be in the middle of sermon prep and get a call from the chief of police, Meade, Kansas, or the sheriff, and they can say, we got a guy who needs X, Y, and Z, and we need you to help him out. And so you again, you schedule into your time that reality that you're going to get called away. Um, but it's a privilege, right? I mean, like spending time with someone in the hospital who doesn't have a pastor, and you get to be there to preach the gospel and to show them the love of Christ. That's a privilege that a lot of guys will never experience, But it's a matter of being involved in your community, earning the right to counsel, and then standing firm on biblical truths and principles in everything you do.
So we only got a couple more minutes left here. What advice and encouragement would you give to those who are seeking rural churches or maybe already serving in a rural church?
Yeah, well, first, if you're doing it or if you're seeking it, do it. You'll love it. It's a very rewarding ministry. In some ways, it's harder than city ministry. In other ways, it's easier. Pros and cons and everything. But the truth is, you're putting so much time and investment into the ministry you have that it's a long-term thing. You're not going to do overnight success here in rural ministry at all. You've got to put time and deep roots in. So I think one of the things I would encourage anybody who's seeking to do it is be prepared for the long haul. If you desire to have a long ministry, a long running ministry, rural ministry is a place where you can definitely make that happen. For guys who are doing it, my advice, don't do it alone. Get guys around you who are godly, strong in biblical principle and character, who will go with you, and take them with you on visits, take them with you on your Bible studies, train them up and teach them. Have guys who will keep you accountable. Never, ever do rural ministry alone. And I think that's true for city ministry as well. But have someone with you. Take someone with you.
So, one final question here. How do you try to balance the difference between actively serving in the community and yet trying to shepherd your family as a pastor in the home? Because we know that in many ways that the local church is where God is doing ministry, but also in the home we find it's almost like a mini church. How do you balance that so that they're still being shepherded and you're pouring into them, and yet you're still pouring into this community that you're so intimately sort of involved with?
Right. Yeah. I think one of the best things I've heard it kind of put is, I married my wife, not the church. The church already has a husband, so I'm not the guy that is meant to be that. And so my family will always take priority and precedence. That's just kind of a personal choice in my ministry. That means sometimes uh, I act. I know that there's certain things in the church that I'm just not going to engage in. Like, not that I'm against that or anything. It's just like I'm going to let someone else take that. That's I've got enough on my shoulders, enough on my plate that I need to eat, that I'm going to let someone else take care of that, and that goes to my family. Um, for me, especially you think about a community, you have 4 or 5 other churches in this community, and there's a lot of interaction with those churches on a regular basis. My kids go to school with kids from the Catholic Church, from the Methodist Church, from the Presbyterian Church. They are engaged in sports and in classroom time and extracurricular activities with those kids. And so I have to be very intentional about teaching my kids biblical truth and filling in gaps. Like, my kids' church is Emmanuel. That's where we go to church. Um, I mean, there are other things. So, for instance, on Wednesday night we have Awana. There are other churches that do things on Wednesday night, but my kids go to Awana here at Emmanuel. Now, I've had more than once my kid come to me and ask me if they could go to this program at this church with a friend, and it's like, no, this is our church, and we have a commitment here, and this is where we're going. But I have to be very intentional to kind of fill in the gaps and walk them through that and be careful with those things, because
It's a balance. It really is. It's a lot to have to think through. Brandon, I just want to say thank you for your advice and what you've given to us here. I think you've really given us a lot of great things to think about and how to engage in a rural church context. So we'll have to bring you on again. We'll go much deeper on this topic, but I really appreciate it. Guys, what I want us to look at here is that as we're trying, guys, what I want us to look at is as we're trying to look at this type of ministry, it is that God is doing great things in a rural setting. And I want to encourage you to not run away or shy away from this kind of ministry. It's definitely something God is calling so many people to. And if this is you, please reach out to us. Stay connected and stay encouraged, as we're here to support you for the call of ministry that God has given you in your local church at this day and age.